Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this briefing on the amended draft bill or the draft bill for the amendment of Section 25 of the Constitution. It's an incredibly important issue, and this is only the start of what might be a very long battle to save our constitutional dispensation. And to quote a famous man, it might not be the beginning of the end, but at least it's the end of the beginning. To give a briefing on the proposed amendment, we have the Institute of Race Relations' Head of Policy Research, Dr. Anthea Jeffery, who will give the briefing and take questions afterwards, and I will be chairing the questions just to make sure that we get one from the entire crowd and get some real discussion going. Thank you very much. Dr. Jeffery.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My topic indeed, as Herman was saying, is to look at the constitutional amendment bill that is going to bring about expropriation without compensation, or EWC. The first time the Bill of Rights has been amended, the first time that an EWC option has been put on the table in South Africa. So it's a matter of great moment, and it seems important to understand what the bill says and then to try and unpack its likely costs and consequences. So let me start by what the bill says, and I'm going to begin with the first subsection. There's an addition to the existing clause, and it says that where land and any improvements thereon are expropriated for the purposes of land reform, then a court may determine that the amount of compensation should be nil. And I've highlighted what I think are two key words in this clause. The first is improvements. Even if we assume that certain land has been stolen and that this is the rationale for the failure to pay compensation, we've certainly had both the ANC and the EFF saying at times that nothing should be paid for stolen land. It's hard to see that the later improvements erected on that land have also been stolen. And so if theft is the rationale for EWC, it's now being extended to improvements, even though the reason for it is not clear. It is, of course, true, let me just go back. What the ad hoc committee has said is when you get a building on land like this one, it sticks to the land. You can't obviously pick it up and take it off. And because it accedes to the land, therefore it should be treated in the same way. But that really isn't a convincing argument. We have more than enough methodologies for ascertaining the value of the land and ascertaining the value of the building on it as separate exercises. The other word I want to pick up on is land reform, and just to make the point that particularly under the rubric of restitution, the restoration of land from which people were dispossessed after 1913, you can have claims that extend very far. And the obvious example, perhaps, was one that was lodged in Pretoria North in about 2015, which covered the whole suburb of Linwood, the whole of Mamelodi, which also covered industrial areas, shopping centres, private hospitals, and so on. And I think there may be some perceptions in South Africans that they'll never be affected by land reform. But nobody knows how far a land claim may extend. And certainly it's possible that South Africans from every walk of life, both black and white, could be affected by land claims and hence by the EWC option. What else does the EWC bill say? It says in a new section 25(3)(a) that national legislation must set out specific instances or circumstances where a court may determine that compensation will be nil. And that is enormously problematic, because we simply don't know what new national legislation might be adopted from time to time in the future, each time simply by a 51% majority. It creates a vista of one after the other statute providing for EWC in circumstances that are now even quite hard to envisage. What it also means is that a constitution should provide certainty It should, at the minimum, set out parameters, if not all the details. But this is extraordinarily vague. We can, however, think of 3 bits of national legislation that are pending, possible, probable, and I want to look at them and how they would work in combination with the EWC bill. So first of all, we could have national legislation in the form of the Expropriation Bill of 2019. That has recently been amended. It now provides that you could have nil compensation in 6 listed instances. The list used to be limited to 5. But it also makes it very clear that that's not a closed list, that the circumstances in which nil compensation could be paid are not, in fact, limited to the ones listed in the section. So it now has 6 instead of 5, and it's an open list which can be extended further. And for example, it says that you could have your land and building expropriated for nil compensation if you've abandoned the property and failed to exercise control over it. In an era in which buildings and houses are being hijacked in the CBD in Orange Grove, it may be very difficult for an owner to exercise control over a building. It's a complicated and expensive process to go to court to get an eviction order, to get the people who've moved in, moved out again. And if you fail to do that, then according to this combination of the Constitution and the Expropriation Bill, you will qualify for nil compensation. Similarly, if, say, a house that you've owned in Orange Grove has been invaded, you can't get it back, it's now become a health and safety hazard, that would be reason for taking it for nil compensation. But again, the individual owner may not have been able to do much to prevent that situation and now is greatly penalized further. So we have a situation, in short, where additional grants can always be added by the legislature. As we've already seen, it's gone from 5 to 6. And they can be added in specific instances too. When a case comes before the courts, a judge might decide that even though this is not a listed instance, it should also be one where nil compensation is paid. And it's also just worth noting, and I'm going to spend a little time talking about that expropriation procedures are heavily skewed in favor of the state and against the individual under this bill. So say you have the Johannesburg municipality, it's trying to create a whole lot of dense social housing along Louis Botha, and so it aims to expropriate certain houses along that road, which at the moment are owned by both black and white South Africans. What it is able to do under the bill as it's drafted at the moment is to start investigating the houses. Will they be suitable for this purpose? Send a notice of intention to expropriate, like to take your particular house, and invite you to make representations, which it must consider, but it doesn't have to respond to them, and it doesn't have to give any reasons for rejecting them. And the next thing it can do is issue a notice of expropriation. And that is a very serious document, because under it, ownership will be transferred to the municipality on the date specified in the notice, quite automatically, by operation of law, no need for court intervention, and the same with the right to possess the property. And the only time limit in the bill is that the date for the transfer of ownership can't be the date before the notice was served. So you get the notice on the 11th of December, you can't have lost ownership on the 10th, but you could lose it on the 12th or the 13th or the 14th. There is no other time limit on how soon that transfer of ownership and then of possession might happen. And people might have a legitimate claim. They might be able to go to the court to say this is not really in the public interest, or the compensation is not really just and equitable, especially if it's nil. But most people in that situation, having lost ownership and possession, will find it particularly hard to fight through the courts. So, of course, the municipality should be the one that has to go to court to get confirmation that the expropriation is in the public interest and that the compensation is just and equitable before it proceeds. But the bill allows something different. Then there's other new national legislation that could be introduced as well. We've got our existing expropriation bill. It could be amended in 3 other ways, and I get these ideas directly from the proposals put forward by the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture. It thought, to begin with, that we should have no compensation in 10 listed instances, so rather more than the 6 now reflected in the expropriation bill. And again, it wanted that list to be an open one, not closed, not limited to the particular instances set out on that list. In addition, it was very keen, and particularly in urban areas where the biggest demand for housing is, that municipalities should be able to identify suitable land. Suitable because it's well located in terms of transport and access to work opportunities, and also because it's properly serviced. And of course, there are large areas in most cities that would satisfy those criteria, from Houghton here in the northern suburbs through to Protea Glen. Maybe large parts of Soweto or Ananda would also be seen as falling in that context. And the idea would be you get the existing houses, you break them down, you put up dense social housing instead. And what the panel wants is that once the municipality has identified this land, the owner has 3 choices: to donate it, to sell it to the municipality at a price that can be agreed, or have it expropriated. And the municipality, knowing it has the power to expropriate, is unlikely to be willing to offer a very generous price in the negotiation process. So we may find in very many instances that we come to the third option, the expropriation one, which enormously erodes the certainty of property rights, which creates real doubts for the banks and whether they can accept property as collateral when you could have expropriation in so many instances. And in addition, what they want is a new compensation policy, that compensation in this kind of situation should be nil, not necessarily in the 10 instances they would put in the list, maybe in others as well, it's not clear, or it should be minimal, or it might be substantial, or it might even be market-related, depending on the circumstances. But market-related is not the same as market value. So what is clear is that in none of these instances would the expropriated owner get market value, which would compensate more adequately for the loss of a property. It wouldn't deal with other losses, moving losses, perhaps a loss of income from a property you can no longer use. But market value at least gives you back a little bit more, but it wouldn't be on the horizon. We could also have national legislation in the form of a custodianship law. The new bill could vest all land and the improvements on it in the custodianship of the state. It would be similar to the MPRDA, that's the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act of 2002, which vested all mineral resources in the custodianship of the state, and also to what I briefly called the Agri-Land Bill of 2014, which had a much more complicated name. That talked about vesting all agricultural land, in other words, all land that hadn't yet been classified as urban land, in the custodianship of the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, as it was then. So the custodianship idea is not something that's limited to the EFF. The ANC has put it into a bill already. It took it out when there was a lot of opposition and a lot of arguments about constitutionality, but it's not an idea that it's necessarily given up. And this bill would say that this kind of vesting of custodianship is a specific instance where a court may determine that compensation is nil. Would we then have a plethora of cases going to the courts? I fear not, that you'd probably only have one case going to the Constitutional Court, and once that had confirmed that no compensation should follow the vesting of custodianship, that would settle the matter for everyone. And that means, as the EFF has so graphically put it, that your title deed will mean nothing. Everybody will need a land use license from the state. It might last for something like 25 years, but it might also be terminated at any point in the public interest. And this would apply as much to business as it would to individuals. We think that there are many procedural problems in the way the bill is being crafted. First of all, we think it goes beyond the ad hoc committee's mandate to make explicit what is implicit in Section 25. First of all, because the committee was instructed to look at land and it's added improvements thereon as well, which is quite a change. And in addition, by referring to that, the possibility of national legislation setting out many other instances for nil compensation, that goes far beyond what Section 25 envisages. Excuse me. Then, We also have concerns about whether Section 74 of the Constitution is adequately being upheld. This is the section that lays out their procedures to be used in amending the Bill of Rights. And there are real arguments to be raised that what is being done is not appropriate, and in particular whether mooted change undermines the rule of law, as this one does, because the rule of law requires certainty, and this will generate a great deal of uncertainty. It also requires equality before the law, and we've certainly had statements from politicians that the rules will be played unevenly. They may, for example, exonerate the Zulu king, but not other people. And in addition, there's a strong argument to be made that property rights are intrinsic to the rule of law, which it must protect both the personal liberty of the individual and also his property, in which case there are many difficulties in the way in which this bill is being adopted. There are other possible unconstitutional shortcomings too, and the IRR is working with its lawyers on a court challenge, which we hope to bring late January, early February, as soon as all the necessary steps can be taken. The government has always argued, of course, that EWC is intended to help, but we believe that it will hurt instead. And that's really why it's almost obligatory to go to court to try and challenge it, because the damage that it could do will be so enormous. Property rights and the current Section 25, which protects them, are vital to all South Africans, both black and white. I think we're all familiar with the history of the country in which for a long period black people were barred from owning land in the rural areas or houses in the urban areas. But that finally, thank goodness, began to change in the late 1970s and early 1980s. In 1983, we had the great housing sale in Soweto, where people who were simply in occupation of houses were able to buy them for a minimal amount. And helped by that, plus the RDP program since 1994, we now have a situation where 8.5 million black, coloured, and Indian people are homeowners. They don't always have title deeds, which is a problem, and they need to be granted title deeds which are secure. But they are homeowners, generally of formal structures made of brick and mortar. We also have 1.1 million or so white homeowners. We have 18 million blacks with customary plots, mostly in the former homeland areas. And we have 6.1 million hectares of land in both urban and rural areas that has been bought by black people since 1991 for a sum of around 70 billion rand, and that includes 4.4 million hectares in the rural lands. There are very many black South Africans with property rights who stand to be negatively affected by an EWC option. If we have the EWC bill in force, if we have the expropriation bill, even the current one, with its 6 listed grounds in force, then all of these people could face expropriation, particularly at the hands of bankrupt municipalities. All of them will be expropriating authorities under the expropriating bill. They're already owed 1.65.5 billion rand, which is a staggering amount. And many of them will think, well, if we could just get some land and turn it into a housing project and lease it out, this would be an important source of income. And there are some worrying examples where black people are already being affected. So, for example, in the Stanger area in KwaZulu-Natal, Becky Dlamini is fighting for the return of 31,000 hectares of land expropriated from him by the Kwaduka local municipality for a housing project. And he says without his even knowing about it. And there's also the case of in Mpumalanga, the owner of the Akaland farm was given 7 days, mostly over the 2018 Easter weekend, to hand over the keys of the property to the state, which seemed also a very cavalier approach. And there are similar threats to customary plots near Pinetown in Durban, in the Kwandengezi area. Land for housing is in high demand. You can sell it for lots of money. And it seems, from reports that surface from time to time, that certain councillors have been acting quite illegally and simply taking some of this land, using it for housing, refusing to pay anything at all, intimidating people who object. And once they have the power of the law behind them, abuses are likely to expand. Then there's another argument that EWC will bring redress. We see that as a fake claim. Because, of course, EWC is going to empower the state not disadvantaged black South Africans. It's the state that's going to get the land, not the people who were barred from ownership in the apartheid era. So the state plans to keep ownership or custodianship if it takes that. And that's very evident from the state land lease and disposal policy that was developed in 2013. And according to that policy, if you're a black farmer producing something for the market, you must first lease your land for 30 years, and then for another 20 years, and then you might get an option to buy. But if you're a subsistence farmer producing only for your own needs, then you must lease in perpetuity. And we can see how badly this rule has worked in the case of David Rukasi. He's been working the same land for more than 20 years. In 2002, he was promised by the ANC state that they would sell the land to him. Then they dragged their heels, then they reneged, and they finally just said no, they wouldn't. They'd offer him a lease. And finally, in 2019, the Pretoria High Court said that this was irrational and arbitrary and unreasonable, particularly because what they wanted at this point was for the 70-year-old David Rukasi to enter first into a 30-year lease, and then into a 20-year lease, and then maybe have the option to buy. And the court gave that short shrift, but that's the policy. So David Rukasi is in fact still in problems. There was a time when the state said it was going to appeal. Now it's saying it's not sure that it can transfer all the land because some of it has been occupied by other people quite illegally. David Rukasi has not been able to evict them because he's not been the owner. So perhaps he'll only get a portion of the land. In other words, it just sums up the point that EWC is going to empower the state and not ordinary black South Africans. EWC is also not needed for land reform. That's another fake claim. We know that about 70% of transferred land has fallen out of production. Often the people who were farming on that land have lost their jobs. There have been no real benefits. The Fiscal and Financial Commission did a study a couple of years ago and reported, in fact, that land reform beneficiaries were worse off than those who had never benefited from land reform at all. And EWC can't counter what are the real reasons for failure, which are poor post-settlement support, either in the form of training or money, gross inefficiency, which permeates the work of the department. There's no individual ownership, so therefore people can't use their land as collateral for loans to get working capital from the banks. Corruption, which pushes up land, which affects the process in a million ways. And elite capture, illustrated recently by the Bekenfle farm, which was acquired by the department at the behest really of two ANC insiders. One had worked at the Tuli House for 10 years and they decided they'd really like to have this farm. So the state bought it for them for 97 million rand. And though they weren't on the list of land reform beneficiaries, it then leased it to them and gave them another 30 million rand in working capital. And they sold off the cattle and they sold off all the plant and equipment and they didn't pay the workers. And within a few years, what had been a thriving enterprise simply collapsed. And then finally, their lease was terminated. No benefit. And a form and example of elite capture. And we also know that Section 27 is not the problem, according to the high-level panel of Parliament. This was set up to examine things like land reform, how they're working, what should be done. And they did quite an intensive investigation and reported in 2017 that these factors were the key things that were going wrong, not Section 25. And the Constitutional Review Committee, which came with the recommendation to amend the Constitution to allow EWC, simply failed to entertain the high-level panel. MPs from the opposition ranks repeatedly appealed to them to at least bring them before the committee to hear their views, but that was ignored. Inefficiency is the key issue, not the Constitution or other laws. This is what Judge Edwin Cameron in the Constitutional Court said in August this year, dealing with the Mblazi case. This dealt with labour tenants. 11,000 of them roughly have been waiting since 2001 for their cases to be handled by the authorities. And Judge Cameron was very scathing about the extraordinary inefficiency within the department. He ended up by appointing a special master to oversee its work. If you need a special master to oversee the work of bureaucrats, obviously they're not doing a good job. And EWC is not going to make them do a better job. It will just extend the range of functions that they have to do and make it more likely that they will get it wrong. So what do we need if we're really going to improve the lives of people in both rural and urban areas? What we know, and I think the whole country knows, all the way going back to 1994 when the ANC slogan was jobs, jobs, jobs. That's the key need. And we started doing opinion polls in 2001 where black respondents confirmed to us that that should be the key problem the government focused on. In our most recent one, which we did in December 2018, 27% of black respondents said jobs should be the key. It's gone down a bit because corruption has risen so high. But 2% wanted land reform to be the key. In 2018, in a survey we conducted, 84% of black respondents said growth and jobs was what they wanted, not radical land redistribution. In another survey conducted in August 2018, when the EWC hype was really at its full, we interviewed ANC voters, 36% of whom said, yep, EWC wouldn't be bad if it was directed against whites. But 62% said, no, we don't need land reform. Or if we do, we should do it very differently, using willing buyer, willing seller, or using state land. And when people thought about the possibility that EWC might apply to their own homes, then any support just dropped through the floor. 87% of black respondents said no, they didn't think that would be a good idea, and 89% of ANC voters said the same. They did not want EWC in those circumstances. Those who do want to farm, and it's not very many, but it's a group that needs to be taken care of, despite all the challenges that farming brings, drought, disease, crime, etc., on top of all the normal challenges of running a business, farming is particularly hard to do. They must be helped to do it, and land, of course, is only the first requirement, land in their individual ownership. There are a host of other requirements too, ranging from know-how to labor, electricity, which we all know about, diesel, markets, infrastructure. All of those things have to be in place or it can't succeed. The IRR has come up with an Ipulazi proposal. You'll see a pamphlet about it, about how we could achieve that. In the urban areas, those wanting houses need serviced land, which I think we should get public-private partnership to help achieve. If we wait in the state, it'll take a long time. Tax-funded housing vouchers so that they don't have to wait on the state to build houses for them, but can start organizing their own housing needs, and critically jobs, because people need income. And that has always been the key need. The importance of property rights, just in conclusion. Secure property rights are, of course, vital to investment. The more we erode property rights, the less likely we are to get the investment that President Ramaphosa is trying to drum up. Without investment, we're not going to get growth, we're not going to have more jobs, we're not going to have upward mobility and prosperity. And the importance of property rights are confirmed by the Fraser Institute's Global Index of Economic Freedom. And if you look at that most recent version, it just indicates that the most free countries have much higher average GDP per person of $36,800, and the least free have 6,000 basically, which is 6 times less. It's a big, big divergence. And the average income of the poorest people in the most free countries is about $10,700, much less than the least free, in fact, 7 times less. So having economic freedom in the true sense of the word, including respect for property rights, is enormously important to prosperity, and especially so for the poor. In the most free countries, 1.8% are extremely poor, with $1.90 a day, but the proportion is much higher, 27.2% in the least free countries. And there's also a political dimension. So I like to end with a quote from Friedrich Hayek, who said, "The system of private property is the most important guarantee of freedom, not only for those who own property, but also for those who do not. It is only because the control of the means of production is divided among many people acting independently that nobody has complete power over us. Politically, we need to make sure that we retain the situation where the control of land is divided among many people, not concentrated in the state." Thank you.